So we're starting a new series today. You can kind of look at the list here. Maybe you have, I got a new planner. I don't know about you, 2019. And I can tell you that in the planner, this particular kind of planner, it has a section of the things that you want to accomplish in the year 2019. And I can tell you some of the things that I put on that list, but I can tell you one of the things that I did not put on that list. I did not put on that list be perfect. Okay? I don't know about you. But as we were, each winter, we tried to focus on a core section of Jesus' teaching. And this year, we're looking at the Sermon on the Mount. And as we were kind of discussing the Sermon on the Mount, we were reading it together and kind of praying through it, and we came across verse 48 of chapter 5 in Matthew that reads as follows: "Be perfect, therefore, as your Father in heaven is perfect." And we thought to ourselves, well, that's provocative. And perhaps when you saw the series title, you thought that provokes not just thought, but anxiety. Seriously? Seriously, perfection is what Jesus is asking us to be. Not what's going on with this particular word. So we're going to, over the next several weeks, over the next, I think, 7 weeks, we'll be looking at the Sermon on the Mount. I encourage you to read the Sermon on the Mount from the Gospel of Matthew, the first gospel in the New Testament, along with us if you'd like. We're going to take a section of it each week, and over the course of those 7 weeks, we'll look at 3 different chapters, chapter 5, 6, and 7. But I thought that, today, when you just consider this particular verse, I think, the first question that comes to mind for me is, like, seriously, is this what you're asking us to be, Jesus? That can't possibly be the aim. It begs the question, ultimately, kind of what does it mean to be perfect? Now, I want to get at what Jesus might mean by that, but I wonder, when you hear the word, what are the associations that come to mind for you? I can tell you some of the associations that come to mind for me. I played sports. I was an athlete. And so one of the first places that I go are to sports. And I think about, in baseball, pitchers can have a perfect game. The last perfect game that was pitched was in 2012 by Felix Hernandez, playing for the Seattle Mariners against the Tampa Bay Rays. And it was a 1-0 victory, and it was 27 straight batters retired without a single hit or an error. It was a perfect game. Or I think about in gymnastics. This past week, UCLA gymnast Caitlin Ohashi scored a perfect 10 on her floor routine, and the video of this routine went viral, and over 40 million people have watched it. There's something about sports that helps us when you think about perfection, that's kind of one of the areas that we think about, and it means a person who has disciplined themselves in such a way that they're striving after some perfect, elusive, and rare but possible performance or achievement. You think about this in terms of school as well as another way. I love school. I'm still in school. I have always loved school, and it's one of those areas of life where in other areas of my life, it's hard to know how I'm judged, but at least in school, I get a grade, I get a mark, I get a measure, and I can know, like, my value, right? I remember in my junior or senior year of high school, I had an English teacher, and she graded my papers unlike anybody else. She didn't just grade for the information. She didn't just grade for the ideas that I was putting across, but she also graded my punctuation and my grammar, and I hated her class. I still have these miserable nightmares about the red pen of my high school English teacher. The sense of perfection, that you could get a perfect score, is something that for some people, it elicits for them this, man, maybe I can achieve this thing. For another person, it is the kind of thing that keeps you in the bed with the covers pulled up over your head. But there are other areas of life. Some people I know are watching Marie Kondo's Tidying Up on Netflix. And this is all about the perfect domestic experience, right? You'll have the perfect perfectly clean and tidy and organized sock drawer. That's another image of perfection. But I think the one that in some ways speaks to this particular cultural moment in American society about the ways in which we think about perfection, it's beauty. It's the way in which Photoshop has distorted our understanding of perfection when it comes to beauty and body image. And check out this picture. Now, the one on the left, of course, is the photo without Photoshop, and the one on the right is the one with Photoshop. And you can kind of see the difference, right? I mean, George Clooney is a beautiful man, don't get me wrong. Without Photoshop, right? But what is it that Photoshop does here? It removes the blemishes and the flaws and the imperfections, right? And I think that is one of the ways, the central ways in which we define what it means to be perfect. If you just look it up in the dictionary, this is a dictionary definition. The condition or state or quality of being free from all flaws and defects. Is that what Jesus is talking about? Is Jesus saying, unless you are perfect in every way, unless you have no flaws or defects or blemishes or imperfections, no areas of your life for which you are ashamed or feel guilty or are insecure, if you can be all of those things, then you can receive my blessing, and if you don't have those things, you can't. That's what I want to talk about, right? Of course, for us, when you hear the call that Jesus makes to be perfect, it doesn't feel comforting or reassuring. What feels more comforting or reassuring are the calls of voices in our culture that push back against these external signs of worth and belonging and judgment, right? The people that say to us what we long to hear. Nobody's perfect, right? Nobody is perfect. I'm not perfect. You're not perfect. It is a gift to embrace one's imperfections, right? It's a way of, all these people out there on Instagram striving to be perfect are the problem. They are the problem. They are holding the rest of us in prison to their external judgment and standards, right? They are psychologically unfit and unhealthy, right? Don't try to be perfect. Let go of all that stuff. Let go of other people's standards of external judgment or measure. Embrace instead not what the society puts on us, but the truth in yourself. You're brave. You are worthy. You do not need to be judged by anybody else. You instead are enough as you are. Don't try to be perfect. Don't try to have a perfect life or perfect house or perfect body. That is absurd. You do you. You just do you. Don't worry about all that stuff. Now, you know what? I appreciate the voices in the culture that push back on kind of the images of perfection that are placed upon us, because they push against the kind of, and allow us to feel more comfortable kind of in our own insecurity, knowing that none of us could ever achieve the standard of perfection if that means flawlessness or without blemish. But is that what Jesus is talking about? I'm convinced that it's not. And you can throw out society's external measures of judgment and worth, but then you fall back on your own kind of self-contained ideas. The idea is that you have to begin to shape for yourself what it looks like to live a good life, what it looks like to flourish, not only as you are, but in the future. And I don't know about you, but for me, that has been a very difficult task, to define for myself what the good life looks like, to define for myself what it looks like to live a beautiful, good, and true life. It creates a whole nother set of anxieties. And I think that's where this kind of self-generated shift to viewing our life only from kind of inside our own scope of vision may be lacking. And where it may come for some of us as a gift to receive a way of looking at the world and a way of perceiving our own lives that comes not from the culture around us, but from beyond all of those words. And that's where Jesus comes in. That's where the Sermon on the Mount comes in. What we'll be receiving over the next several weeks is a vision of a person and a community and a kingdom that are breaking into the world in a way that's both less demanding than you thought and also way more demanding. And it begins with the Beatitudes, kind of that first section of the sermon in which Jesus pronounces, blessed are you who are successful and who make straight A's and who have perfect bodies and who have no wrinkles on their face as George Clooney doesn't, right? No, that's not where the blessing comes from according to Jesus. Blessed are you who are poor in spirit. Blessed are you when you're mourning. Blessed are you who are meek. Blessed are you who hunger and thirst for the world to be set right. Blessed are you who are pure in heart. Blessed are you who are peacemakers. It's like we're in a totally different territory. This is a different part. This is a different vision. It's as if we had gone our whole lives looking out on the burnt out soybean fields of Mississippi, and for the very first time, we have an opportunity to go and gaze upon the Rocky Mountains. It's as if you're seeing something completely new. And the question becomes, how do you read this section of the sermon? I think one of the ways in which Christians have read it in the past, faithful ones, have read it as an ethical instruction, as imperatives for the way in which we should live our lives. And so the way that this reading runs, it's if you want to receive blessing from God, then you should be more poor in spirit, more meek, right? More merciful. You should be a peacemaker instead of just a jerk. And Lord knows we need more merciful, peacemaking people in 2019 in America, right? We need more people that are like that. But I think, that treating the Beatitudes as instruction in that kind of way, it doesn't work for all of the Beatitudes, right? Are we supposed to wander around and look for reasons to mourn and be sad? Is that what we're supposed to do? Or we're supposed to go around looking for people to revile us? I don't know. When you ask those kinds of questions, it begs the question of when you ask those kind of questions, what you end up doing, or at least what I've seen a lot of Christians do, is their strategies of avoidance, frankly. It's a way of saying, this doesn't apply to me. This isn't practical instruction for my life. I don't know what to do with this. I'm out. But maybe the other way that people read it, if it's ethical instruction and moral imperative, you should do this, this, and this, you should be this, this, and this, is you come to a place where it just feels straight up impossible. Like, I could never meet this standard. But what if that's not what the sermon is meant to do? What if there was another way of reading it? If you look at the sermon, if you consider it, there are no imperative verbs. It doesn't say, blessed are those who are doing mercy, for they will receive mercy. It says, no, blessed are the merciful. It's blessed are this category. It's not do this, do this, do this. It's this person, this person, this person is blessed. It's not as much practical, ethical instruction for the moment as doing this other kind of thing. It's not one way. This is a helpful quotation, I think, from Stanley Hauerwas. He says in his commentary on the Sermon on the Mount, and the Beatitudes in particular, it's not so much a list of requirements for who gets to be a part of the kingdom, but rather it's a description of the life of a people gathered by and gathered around Jesus. The Sermon on the Mount, it's not a hero ethic, it's the constitution of the people of God. It's the kingdom community that Jesus is creating. To be saved here is to be gathered together to Jesus and a part of the people that Jesus is creating. The Beatitudes, You can see them as an interpretive key for the entire Sermon on the Mount, precisely because they're not recommendations. Nobody's asking you to go out and try to be poor in spirit, to try to mourn more. But rather, Jesus is indicating that given the reality of the kingdom of heaven that is breaking into this world, you should expect to find in the Christian community, you should expect to find around Jesus some folks who are poor and who are poor in spirit. You should expect to find some folks who are mourning and some who are meek. It's addressed not to individuals, but to the community as a whole, the community that Jesus is inaugurating and bringing into being. Jesus isn't suggesting that all of us go and try to follow him in each of those categories and try to become more of each of them necessarily, but rather, he's not laying down an unattainable code of ethics, but rather a vision of a new community that is gathering around him. So that I think this is the question. The question is not, how do I become more poor in spirit? The question instead is this: how do we become the kind of community in which Jesus can gather the poor in spirit, can gather those who mourn, the meek, the merciful, the pure in heart, and the peacemakers? I mean, if we looked up, this does become a measure for us as a church. If we looked up one day and nobody in our church was mourning, and everybody just had smiles on their face all the time, we would know that something was wrong. It's a measure for our community. If we were vindictive in every one of our judgments over against our neighbors, and we're not merciful, we would know that something was wrong. If there were no people who were poor in spirit in our midst, if there were no people who were making peace, if there were no people in the body of Christ throughout the world who were experiencing some form of persecution over against the culture in which they were living, we would know that maybe we had missed it. Maybe things were a bit askance. And for me, this kind of question, what does it look like for us to become the kind of community that could welcome and gather in those who are poor in spirit, those who are spiritually bankrupt? What does it look like for us to be the kind of community where people who are at the end of their rope, who are desperate for something, and we're crying out to God that this would be the place where they would find themselves? What would it look like for us to create room, not for necessarily the kids that were crushing the grades, right? But as Alex is doing, creating room in our community for the kids that aren't, that are anxious every single day when they go to school because they know that they don't measure up. What does it look like to embody the welcoming heart of Christ in such a way that those who are meek and tired and sat upon and spat upon and ratted on, that they felt welcome and gathered in to what Jesus was doing? It would look like something attractive, I think, to the world around us. Jesus said, immediately after the Beatitudes, Jesus talks about two images for the church. And I may get, if you don't mind, Evan, going back to the last 2 or 3 verses that we read this morning, when Jesus says, the church is salt and light. You are the salt of the earth, right? Salt, I use salt all the time. I love salt. It flavors. You don't have to use a lot. It usually is invisible in the things that you're using to cook with it, and yet it has a way of flavoring the whole deal. Or you can think about salt as a preserving quality in the midst of a spoiled and corrupted and contaminated kind of world. It's the thing that keeps things fresh and alive. The image of light is even more powerful and one that we're more familiar with, right? You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. Oftentimes I wonder in 2019 if the church is so diminished as to not be this blazing garrison on the midst of a hill, but rather like just a half-burning light. But I'll tell you the truth. Every time I see one person go to the food pantry, or one person like Alex gather together 65 kids in our community, right? When I see one college student say, I want to go on a short-term mission trip, when I see one person go to the prisons, right, and take letters, when I see one person in our community say, you know what, I wonder if we don't really have a grief care group in Oxford, I think we need to be doing that. When I hear about one person who desires to create space and connection between our church and the AA and NA community, when somebody says, what would be our next faithful step in terms of welcoming and gathering them in? When I hear about one of you doing those kind of things, I get excited because it reminds me that we don't have to be a blazing garrison on a hill. We just need to be a half-lit light, because every time we do that in the midst of the darkness of this world, light pierces darkness, right? We talked about this on Christmas. It remains true in January that the world can be a dark, cold, and confusing place. And the church, it can sound pretentious, right? For the church to say, we the light on the hill, Everybody come over here because we're awesome. No. But what we can do is be the kind of people that have so opened our hearts and minds and lives to the living Christ, Emmanuel, God with us, the Lord and King and teacher, that we would be gathered together by Christ in such a way that Christ would carve out in the midst of this world a place for all to be gathered in. I've seen it a couple times, and it is truly amazing. When I was right out of college, struggling to figure out what I was doing. I've told some of you this story before, but I moved to Nashville, Tennessee, got a job that I ended up absolutely hating. Ultimately, I went to seminary. But in the midst of that year, when I was really confused, I found myself walking into the doors of St. Augustine's Chapel, which was a worshiping community at Vanderbilt University with students and professors and community members and folks off the street. And the priest there was Becca Stevens, who at that time was developing a relationship with a lot of women in Nashville who had experienced prostitution, incarceration, and substance abuse. And she, alongside the church, marshaled the resources of a portion of Nashville to create a recovery and rehabilitation effort that they called Magdalene House, which was for about 12 women. And then they had 2 Magdalene houses for about 24. And they would walk with these women for 2 years. And at the end of it, a lot of the women would have been rehabilitated. They were experiencing for the first time freedom from the kinds of substance abuse and real abuse that they had experienced. They walked around with those scars, but they could live a new life. But they didn't have jobs. They didn't know what they were going to do. And so they took the church, they took the next step. They created an organization called Thistle Farms to create Bath and Body Works products. And the women ultimately made the products, owned the business, sold and told their stories, and they've told it now all over the country and all over the world. But when I was there, what was most impressive to me was every Sunday when I would come in hungry, right? Desiring to see something that I hadn't seen before in the world. Longing to be a part of something that was making a difference. Longing to see a vision from beyond my carved-in vision of what was possible. This church was showing it to me. They were living it. They were doing it. And every time I would come forward, they had communion every Sunday, and I would walk in those lines with confused college students and professors and community members and the homeless and these women who were recovering. I saw something of what Jesus longs to do in every time and place. To draw people from every tribe and nation and people and language and race from all over the world to himself, so that the world might know that light pierces the darkness. Let us pray. Jesus, we need new vision, not only of who we can be, but of the ways in which you are drawing us to a much different picture than the world offers, not only for us as individuals, but for us as a church. May we open ourselves more fully to who you are and to what you desire to do in the world through the church. In the name of Christ, amen.